What if the gods didn't disappear from Earth, but simply learned to rule without being seen? Ancient Mesopotamian texts record something strange: gods who once made decisions alongside humans, and then stopped appearing while everything they built stayed in place. This isn't made-up fiction. It's recorded in thousands of clay tablets covering 3,000 years of continuous civilization, temple records, royal writings, law books, and ritual instructions. The texts describe divine beings called the Anunnaki, managers, judges, and lawmakers who gave out cities, divided cosmic power, and walked among humanity as visible rulers. And then, after the Great Flood, they simply pulled back. But here's what makes this haunting: nothing actually changed. Kings still ruled by divine permission. Priests still guarded divine knowledge. Laws still came from heaven. Temples still worked as connection points with the sky. The entire power structure stayed intact. Only the gods themselves were no longer physically present. The evidence is available to everyone. The evidence for this isn't locked away in secret vaults. It's been translated and published in academic journals for over a century. It sits in museums across the world, carved on clay tablets no bigger than your hand. These aren't myths found alone. They're administrative records, king lists, legal introductions, and ritual instructions that describe a system of government claiming to come from beyond humanity itself. The Sumerian king list, a document that changes everything. One document captures this transition with disturbing clarity. It's called the Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies found at several archaeological sites. The most complete version was discovered in 1922 by a British expedition at the ruins of Larsa, an ancient Sumerian city in what is now southern Iraq. What makes this text remarkable isn't just its age, it's its structure. The king list is written in two distinct sections, separated by a single catastrophic event. Before the flood, it records kingship as something that descended from heaven, not symbolically, but as an actual transfer of power from the divine realm to earth. It names specific cities, specific rulers, and specific sequences of power. After the flood, it continues in exactly the same documentary style, naming kings, cities, and dynasties, but now it includes rulers we know were historically real. Archaeological evidence confirms their existence. Their inscriptions have been excavated. Their cities have been uncovered. Gilgamesh appears in this list. So does Enmebar Jesse of Kish. His name was found on actual temple artifacts. These aren't mythological figures. They're historical individuals. The problem this creates an impossible problem for conventional interpretation. If the post-flood section of the king list is accepted as genuine historical record and mainstream scholarship does accept it, then how do we dismiss the pre-flood section when it's written by the same scribes, in the same style, as part of the same continuous narrative? The document makes no distinction. It presents divine rule and human rule as a single unbroken chain of authority, interrupted only by the flood. The pattern across thousands of texts. But the king list is only the beginning. Across thousands of Mesopotamian texts spanning Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian periods, a consistent pattern emerges. Early narratives describe gods as active decision-makers who assign territories, judge disputes, issue decrees, and manage the world directly through visible presence. Later texts describe those same gods as sources of authority, still granting kingship, still providing laws, still demanding obedience, but now operating through human go-betweens. Priests interpret divine will through ritual. Kings rule as appointed representatives. Justice is delivered in the God's name. The gods are no longer here, but they're still in charge. This isn't about gods fading from memory. This isn't a story about gods disappearing from human imagination. Every civilization has myths that fade. This is about something far stranger: a governance system that continues to function as if the gods are watching, even after they stop appearing. A civilization that behaves as though power comes from beyond humanity, and never questions whether that power truly left. The central question. Which brings us to the question that shapes everything that follows. If the Anunnaki were once described as rulers who walked on earth, issued commands, and governed directly, and if the systems they established, divine kingship, priestly mediation, heavenly law, sacred bloodlines, remained fully operational after they withdrew, then what kind of disappearance leaves behind a world that still obeys? If you're drawn to the mysteries hidden in ancient records, subscribe to join us as we unravel them. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing this content travels across time zones the way these ancient stories traveled across thousands of years. The visuals in this video are here to add atmosphere, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the evidence speak for itself. Understanding what the Anunnaki's withdrawal actually means. To understand what the Anunnaki's withdrawal actually means, we need to first understand what their presence looked like in the earliest sources, not as poetic symbols, not as distant cosmic forces, but as something far more precise: administrators with assigned roles, decision-making councils, and direct authority over earthly affairs. Let's start with what the oldest texts actually describe. There's no departure story. The oldest texts don't describe a departure. There's no farewell speech, no final decree, no dramatic rise into the heavens recorded in the way cultures typically remember significant events. What the Mesopotamian record shows instead is something more subtle and far more unsettling. The gods simply stop appearing in the same way. Early narratives depict divine beings making decisions, assigning territories, judging disputes, actively participating in the management of the world. Later texts still reference those same beings, still invoke their authority, still claim their approval, but now the gods operate through channels, through kings who speak for them, priests who interpret their will, rituals that maintain contact, and omens that signal their intentions. The system remains. The source becomes invisible. The longest written record in history. Mesopotamia offers us the longest continuous written record of any ancient civilization, over 3,000 years of cuneiform inscriptions preserved on clay tablets. This isn't oral tradition filtered through centuries of retelling. It's documentation, administrative records, temple archives, royal histories, legal codes, ritual instructions, letters, receipts, prayers. It's written memory. And within that memory, the Anunnaki appear not as a modern conspiracy invention, but as a consistent category in Mesopotamian religious language. The term surfaces across Sumerian hymns, Akkadian epics, Babylonian prayers, and Assyrian royal inscriptions. Sometimes they're described as a council of deities, sometimes as judges of fate, sometimes as the collective term for gods who descended to earth to establish order. They're named. They're assigned roles. They're invoked in legal proceedings and coronation ceremonies. The record shifts. But then the record shifts. The earliest myths like the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis describe the Anunnaki deciding to create humanity, assigning labor, managing resources, intervening directly when problems arise. The gods don't just exist in these stories. They act. They debate. They issue decrees called me in Sumerian cosmic principles that govern everything from kingship to metalworking to temple construction. Divine presence is operational. But by the time we reach historical periods, the dynasties whose rulers left inscriptions on foundation stones and cylinder seals, something has fundamentally changed. Kings still claim their thrones were granted by the gods. Priests still perform rituals to maintain divine favor. Laws still invoke heavenly authority. Yet the gods themselves no longer appear as characters in the narrative of daily governance. They become authors of authority rather than actors within it. The infrastructure remains intact. Meanwhile, the infrastructure they supposedly established remains completely intact. Consider what continues after this shift. Cities still have patron deities whose temples function as economic and political centers. Kingship is still described as descending from heaven in royal propaganda. Justice is still framed as the execution of divine will rather than human invention. Priests maintain elaborate systems of divination, reading livers, observing stars, interpreting oil patterns in water to figure out what the no-absent gods desire. The machinery of divine rule continues to function without the physical presence of its operators. A historical puzzle. This creates a historical puzzle that conventional interpretation struggles to resolve. If the Anunnaki were merely symbolic representations of natural forces or philosophical concepts, as mainstream scholarship often suggests, why do the texts treat them as historical administrators before the flood, and as ongoing sources of authority after it? Why doesn't the narrative style change? The scribes who recorded the Sumerian king list, who copied the Atrahasis epic, who inscribed Hammurabi's law code, who documented temple rituals spanning centuries, they made no distinction between the age when gods ruled directly and the age when gods ruled through go-betweens. To them, it was a single continuous system. The transition isn't marked by crisis. The transition isn't marked by crisis in the texts. There's no war that drives the gods away, no defeat, no rebellion that succeeds. The flood disrupts the world, certainly, but after the waters recede, kingship immediately descends from heaven again. According to the king list, authority picks up precisely where it left off, just routed through different channels. What makes this different from other mythologies? This is what makes the Mesopotamian record so peculiar when compared to other ancient mythologies. Greek gods eventually become literary devices. Egyptian deities gradually absorb into philosophical concepts. But Mesopotamian divine authority never becomes symbolic in their own texts. It becomes mediated. The gods don't fade into poetry, they fade into procedure. Every coronation ceremony invokes their approval. Every law code claims their authorship. Every temple ritual maintains the connection. Every omen reading seeks their guidance. The entire civilization continues to orient itself toward beings who are no longer visibly present, but whose absence somehow strengthens, rather than weakens, the system claiming their authority. The defining question. Which brings us to the question that defines this entire investigation. If the Anunnaki were once described as decision-makers in the world, what did that rule actually look like in the oldest sources? And what exactly changes later? What divine rule actually looked like? To understand what divine rule looked like in the earliest Mesopotamian sources, you have to abandon the idea of gods as distant cosmic forces, occasionally stepping into human affairs. The text describes something far more structured. In myths like the Atrahasis epic and Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki don't rule through miracles or mysterious forces. They meet in assemblies. They debate courses of action. They vote on decisions. They assign specific responsibilities to specific deities, dividing the labor of managing the world, the way a government divides administrative departments. Enki receives control over the underground freshwater realm, the Abzu, which controls irrigation and fertility. Enlil governs the atmosphere, winds, and storms that determine agricultural success. Inanna claims authority over warfare, love, and the planet Venus. Udu manages justice and oversees oaths. Ninhursag handles birth and the health of living things. These aren't poetic roles. They're operational jurisdictions. The concept of me divine decrees. The Sumerian concept of me, sometimes translated as divine decrees or cosmic laws, captures this administrative nature perfectly. The me weren't abstract principles. They were the fundamental components of civilization: kingship, priesthood, law, weaponry, music, writing, sexual relations, truth-telling, craftsmanship. In Sumerian tradition, these weren't human inventions that slowly developed. They were design systems given as a complete package governing how society should function. The myth Inanna and Enki describes the goddess Inanna getting the me from Enki and bringing them to her city of Uruk, literally transferring civilizations, operating instructions from one divine administrator to another. The gods in this framework are cosmic officials managing the blueprint of existence. This administrative structure becomes real. But then, and this is crucial, this administrative structure doesn't remain in the realm of myth. It becomes the literal organizing principle of Mesopotamian city-states. Each major city claimed a patron deity who owned that city in a legal sense. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Eridu belonged to Enki. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Belonged to the moon god Nanna. These weren't symbolic relationships. Temple archives record that the god was the city's landlord, and the human population were tenant farmers working divine property. Temples as administrative headquarters. The temple wasn't just a religious building. It was the administrative headquarters of the patron deity's estate. Priests weren't spiritual counselors in the modern sense. They were property managers, accountants, and officials administering the god's holdings. Temple complexes employed hundreds of workers: bakers, brewers, shepherds, weavers, scribes. They controlled vast agricultural lands. They collected taxes given as offerings. They distributed food to workers. They kept careful records of everything moving in and out. Archaeological excavations have recovered thousands of these administrative tablets from temple archives. They document grain shipments, textile production, livestock counts, labor assignments, land sales, the entire economic machinery of a city, organized around the premise that the god physically lived in the temple's inner sanctuary and required material support. A day in ancient Sumer. Imagine a city at dawn in 3rd millennium Sumer. Farmers bring portions of their harvest to the temple complex. Scribes seated in the courtyard record each delivery on clay tablets, updating the inventory in the god's warehouse. Inside, priests prepared the morning meal: bread, beer, roasted meat, arranging it before the cult statue in the sanctuary. Musicians perform. Incense burns. The ritual declares the god present, consuming the offering, governing from this physical location. Meanwhile, the king, who rules as the god's appointed representative, issues judgments in legal disputes, but frames each decision as enforcing divine law, rather than personal authority. Boundaries between fields are sacred because the gods assigned the land. Contracts are sworn before divine witnesses. Justice doesn't come from human reasoning. It comes from maintaining the cosmic order the gods established. This system doesn't separate religious and political authority, because the entire civilization is designed as an extension of divine administration. The impossible question. But then the question becomes impossible to ignore. If gods once managed this system directly, living in temples, receiving offerings, issuing decrees through oracles and omens, why does the exact same structure continue after the gods stop appearing physically? Why do temples still function as economic centers even when the gods become absent landlords? Why do kings still claim their authority descends from heaven even when heaven stops sending visible confirmation? Why do priests still interpret divine will even when that will arrives only as symbolic signs rather than direct communication? The machinery outlasts the operators. What this means? Consider what this means. A civilization can be structured around divine authority so thoroughly that the god's physical presence becomes optional. The system they designed continues to enforce obedience, organize labor, distribute resources, and legitimize power, all while functioning as if the gods are still watching from the sanctuary's inner chamber. The administrative structure becomes self-running. Different from other mythologies. This is what makes the Mesopotamian transition so different from simple mythological evolution. Greek gods fade into stories. Roman gods get absorbed into philosophy. But Mesopotamian gods transition from active administrators to authorizing sources. And the civilization barely notices because the procedures they established remain unchanged. The decrees still have force. The temples still have authority. The kingship still descends from heaven. Only now humans execute every function while attributing it to divine origin. The most unsettling question. Which raises the most unsettling question of this entire investigation. If the gods govern through decrees in city temples, what happens when kings begin claiming those decrees as their own authority without the gods physically appearing? Kingship a heavenly institution. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening in the structure of political authority itself. While temples functioned as divine administrative centers, a parallel system emerged that would prove even more lasting: the ideology of kingship as a heavenly institution, rather than a human invention. The Sumerian king list makes this clear in its opening statement. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an aridu. Not established, not created, not earned, descended. The language is deliberate and consistent across multiple copies of the text found at different sites spanning centuries. Kingship exists first in the divine realm, then transfers downward to earth as a complete system already designed, already authorized, already legitimate before any human claims it. The foundation of political theory. This isn't unique to the king list. It's the foundational premise of Mesopotamian political theory. Royal inscriptions from every period, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, repeat the same formula with ritualistic precision. Kings don't seize power through strength or popular support, at least not in their official statements. They're chosen by the gods, called by name, installed on the throne by divine decree. Their authority flows downward from a source beyond human society. Examples from royal inscriptions. Consider the inscription of Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur around 2100 BC. When Enlil had given the kingship of Ur to Nana, king of the city, looked with favor upon me, Ur-Nammu, and made my reign firm upon the throne. Hammurabi, his law code prologue begins. When the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, determined the destiny of the land, they gave to Marduk supreme rule over all people. At that time, Anu and Enlil named me, Hammurabi, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land. The pattern repeats. The pattern repeats endlessly. The king receives his throne. His reign is made firm. His name is called. His destiny is determined always by divine action, never by human choice alone. This isn't decorative language added after the fact. It's the source code of legitimacy. Why divine authorization matters. In a world of competing city-states where boundaries shift and dynasties rise and fall through conquest and alliance, the question of who has the right to rule becomes critical. Military strength can take a throne, but it can't justify keeping it. Wealth can buy loyalty, but it can't create obligation. Tradition can preserve a dynasty, but it can't authorize the first king. Only heaven can do that. By anchoring authority in the divine realm, kingship becomes something that goes beyond human politics. The king chosen by the gods isn't just stronger than his rivals. He's cosmically legitimate. Opposing him isn't rebellion against a powerful man. It's resistance to the order of the universe itself. It's a technology of rule more powerful than any army. Kingship survives the flood. But then the fascinating detail emerges. The king list presents this divinellicist authority as continuous across the flood boundary. Before the catastrophe, kingship descends from heaven and passes through 8 rulers across 5 cities. The flood sweeps over and then immediately kingship descends from heaven again to the city of Kish, and the list continues without interruption. The institution survives the apocalypse. No distinction between mythic and historical. More importantly, the list makes no distinction in style or authority between the pre-flood kings, whose reigns span impossibly long periods, and the post-flood rulers who become historically verifiable. Gilgamesh of Uruk appears in the same documentary format as Ululim of Eridu. Both receive their kingship from the same source. Both rule with the same divine approval. The king list treats mythic time and historical time as a single continuous chain of legitimate authority descending from heaven through an unbroken succession of appointed rulers. A rhetorical masterpiece. This creates a rhetorical masterpiece. By blending the sacred past with the historical present in one seamless narrative, the list suggests that current kings rule with the same divine authorization as the legendary figures of ancient times. The age of gods walking on earth may have ended, but the mechanism they established kingship as heavenly institution continues to function perfectly. Authority doesn't require divine presence. It only requires divine origin. And once that principle becomes accepted, the question of whether gods still actively step in becomes almost irrelevant. The system operates on the premise that power flows from above regardless of whether the source remains visible. Coronation rituals. Consider what this means in practice. The king rising to the throne in historical Mesopotamia would participate in elaborate coronation rituals designed to demonstrate divine selection. He would enter the temple of the city's patron god. Priests would perform ceremonies calling on the deity's approval. Sacred objects would be presented. Oaths would be sworn. The entire procedure acted out the moment of divine appointment, making visible what the ideology claimed was happening invisibly. The ritual creates the reality it describes. Kingship becomes inheritable. And because kingship is divinely sourced, it becomes inheritable in ways that purely human authority never could. The son doesn't just succeed his father through biological accident. He receives the divine approval passed down through a sacred bloodline. Dynasty becomes theology. Family succession becomes cosmic continuity. The language of divine appointment transforms from religious belief into political infrastructure. It controls heaven's voice. But here's where the system reveals its most crucial feature. If kings rule because heaven authorizes them, then someone must control access to heaven's voice. Someone must interpret divine will. Someone must confirm that the gods have indeed chosen this particular individual to receive the descending kingship. The temples weren't just economic machines managing divine property, though they certainly were that. They were also the communication channels through which divine authority could be verified, interpreted, and, when necessary, redirected. Priests didn't just run the gods' estates. They authenticated the gods' political decisions. The withdrawal strengthens the system. Which means that the withdrawal of direct divine presence doesn't weaken the system, it potentially strengthens it. Because now, rather than gods making their choices visible for all to see, those choices must be figured out through ritual, omen, oracle, and priestly interpretation. The go-betweens become essential. It controls access to heaven. If kings rule because heaven authorizes them, it controls access to heaven's voice. And what happens when that access becomes an institution? Temples, houses for the gods. The answer to who controls heaven's voice lies in the architecture itself. Temples in Mesopotamia weren't primarily designed as gathering spaces for group worship, the way modern religious buildings function. They were designed as houses, literal residences for deities who were believed to live physically within the innermost sanctuary. The god lived in the cult statue. The statue required care, and that care demanded a permanent professional class with exclusive access to the divine presence. Enter the priests. What priests actually did. But to understand what priests actually did, you have to look past religious ceremony and examine the economic reality. Temple archives recovered from sites like Lagash and Nippur reveal institutions managing staggering complexity: thousands of workers, vast agricultural holdings, industrial-scale production of textiles and beer, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated accounting systems, tracking everything down to individual rations of grain and oil. One archive from the city of Girsu contains over 30,000 administrative tablets spanning just a few decades in the 21st century BC. They document daily temple operations in exhaustive detail. How many sheep were slaughtered? Which workers received barley rations? What fields were planted? Which goods were traded? When festivals required additional resources? These weren't holy men thinking about the divine. These were officials managing a complex organization that functioned as the economic backbone of the city-state. Economic power and religious authority were one. But the genius of the system was that economic power and religious authority were inseparable because the god owned the land, controlled the surplus, and authorized all distribution of resources. Every economic transaction became a religious act. Farmers didn't pay taxes to a government. They gave offerings to the deity. Workers didn't receive wages from an employer. They received rations from the god's household. Legal contracts weren't enforced by civic authority. They were sworn before divine witnesses who would punish oath-breakers. The temple was the interface through which divine will showed up as economic and political reality. Control of literacy and knowledge. Meanwhile, the priestly class developed another form of exclusive access even more powerful than economic control: literacy. In a society where writing was a specialized skill requiring years of training, scribes, who were often priests or temple administrators, controlled the production and interpretation of all written knowledge. They composed the royal inscriptions claiming divine appointment. They maintained the temple archives documenting divine property. They copied the ancient myths describing how the gods established civilization. They were the gatekeepers of memory itself. Control of divine communication. But even more crucially, they controlled the technical knowledge required to communicate with the absent gods. When divine presence becomes invisible, civilization needs methods to figure out divine will. Mesopotamian culture developed elaborate systems of divination, ritual technologies designed to extract information from the divine realm through symbolic interpretation. Exispacy: reading animal organs. Exispacy: the reading of animal organs became the most prestigious form. Trained specialists would sacrifice a sheep, remove its liver, and examine every detail of its shape, texture, and color, comparing what they observed against extensive omen catalogs compiled over centuries. The liver wasn't a random object. It was believed to be a message written by the gods, specifically in response to the question asked before the sacrifice. Oil divination. Oil divination works similarly. The priest would pour oil onto water in a sacred bowl, and interpret the patterns formed, how the oil spread, whether it sank or floated, what shapes emerged as divine communication. Celestial observation. Celestial observation tracked the movements of planets, the appearance of eclipses, and unusual atmospheric events. Anything that broke normal patterns could be read as a sign. Extensive astronomical diaries recorded these events alongside corresponding earthly happenings, building a database of connections between heavenly signs and worldly outcomes. The logic was elegant: if gods live in heaven and heaven is visible, then heaven's movements contain encoded messages for those trained to read them. Specialists required. But notice what this system requires. Specialists. Experts. A professional class with years of training in complex interpretive frameworks that ordinary people cannot access. The gods might send signs, but only priests can decode them. Divine will become something produced through ritual technology, rather than something directly experienced. A ritual scene. Imagine the atmosphere. A darkened temple at midnight. Priests gathered around a sacrificed animal. Lamplight flickering across the exposed organs. Absolute silence as the led diviner examines the liver's surface, searching for irregularities that might show divine favor or displeasure regarding the king's military campaign. The god is withdrawn from visible presence, but this ritual makes the god's judgment known. The message is there in the texture of the tissue, in the arrangement of lobes, in the subtle variations from the expected pattern. It just requires interpretation. And whoever controls interpretation controls the divine voice. Authority without presence. This is how authority functions without presence. The gods need not appear for their will to be known. They need only leave signs. And signs require readers. Priests don't replace the gods. They become necessary go-betweens without whom divine authority cannot be accessed. The withdrawal creates dependency. Law is divine transmission. But then something even stranger emerges in the historical record. Kings start publishing law codes as if the laws themselves were received from the gods, rather than invented by human rulers. An Emma's Code, the earliest known, presents its legal judgments as part of the king's divine mission to establish justice in the land, according to the commands of the gods Nana and Udu. Lapidishter's Code similarly frames its laws as fulfilling divine instructions. Hammurabi's famous stone monument depicts the king receiving the symbols of authority directly from the sun god Shamash, before listing nearly 300 case laws. The laws aren't described as practical solutions to social problems. They're presented as cosmic principles sent from heaven to earth through the go-between of divinely chosen kingship. Obedience to law becomes obedience to the gods. Which means that obedience to law becomes obedience to the gods themselves. Breaking a legal code isn't merely a civic violation. It's a disruption of divine order, punishable not just by earthly authorities, but by cosmic forces. Justice itself becomes externalized, attributed to a source beyond human society. Who interprets justice? And who interprets whether justice has been served? Who determines if a judgment aligns with divine will? Who maintains the records of legal history, and ensures proper ritual procedures are followed in courts? The same priestly class that manages the temples, reads the omens, and controls access to written knowledge. The system closes. The system closes into perfect circularity. Kings rule by divine approval. Laws come from heaven. Priests interpret both kingship and law through their exclusive access to divine communication. And the entire structure justifies itself by reference to gods who are no longer present to confirm or deny any of it. Authority flows from an invisible source through channels controlled by institutions, enforcing obedience to a will that can only be known through specialized interpretation. Hammurabi's Law Code. The priests become the interpreters of the gods. What happens when law itself is framed as divine transmission, locking society into obedience to an invisible source? But then the most sophisticated mechanism of the entire system appears, law itself presented as divine transmission, rather than human creation. The monument at the Louvre. Consider the famous Law Code of Hammurabi, carved onto a black basalt monument around 1750 BC and now standing in the Louvre. The monument is nearly 8 feet tall, and its upper section depicts the king standing before the seated sun god Shamash, receiving the symbols of justice and kingship, a rod and ring representing authority to measure and bind, to establish order and enforce boundaries. The image establishes the relationship before a single law is listed. The king doesn't invent justice, he receives it. The prologue. The prologue makes this clear across dozens of lines of carefully written text. But the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, who determines the destinies of the land, determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, the Enlil functions over all mankind, made him great among the Igigi, called Babylon by its exalted name, made it supreme in the world, established for him in its midst, an enduring kingship. At that time Anu and Enlil named me to promote the welfare of the people, me, Hammurabi, the devout God-fearing prince, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. The structure matters. The structure of the sentence matters. The gods act first. They determine, they establish, they name. Hammurabi's role is secondary. He's called, named, sent to carry out a mission designed by divine authority. Nearly 300 laws. Then come nearly 300 case laws covering everything from property disputes to medical mistakes, from inheritance rights to false accusations, from farming contracts to bodily injury. Each follows the same myth and format. If a certain situation occurs, then this specific consequence follows. But these aren't presented as the king's practical solutions to social problems. They're cosmic principles made visible through royal enforcement. The epilogue. The epilogue reinforces this framing. The judgments which I have pronounced, the decisions which I have rendered, let any wronged man who has a lawsuit come before the statue of me, the King of Justice, and let him have my inscribed monument read aloud to him. Let him hear my precious words, and may my monument clarify his case for him. The statue speaks. The stone itself becomes an oracle of divine justice. What appears to be human law functions as revelation. The pattern extends beyond Hammurabi. This pattern extends far beyond Hammurabi. Anamu's earlier code begins with divine approval. The gods and Enlil give kingship to Nana, who then raises Anamu with the mission to establish justice in the land. Lapidishtar's code similarly opens with the god Enlil calling the king by name and ordering him to establish justice in Sumer and Akkad. Even the more broken law codes from Ashnuna and later Assyrian periods maintain this formula. Authority descends from heaven. Kings carry out divine commands. Laws represent cosmic order imposed on human society. The psychological power. The psychological power of this framework cannot be overstated. When law comes from human lawmakers, it can be questioned, changed, or rejected through political process. Laws become negotiable expressions of current social agreement, always open to revision based on changing circumstances or better reasoning. But when law comes from the gods, resistance transforms into something far more dangerous than political disagreement. It becomes sacrilege, a challenge to the structure of reality itself. Breaking a divinely authorized law isn't merely illegal. It's cosmically wrong. The offense extends beyond the earthly court into the realm of divine judgment. Even if human enforcement fails, the gods see everything. Even if you escape earthly punishment, cosmic consequences remain. Withdrawal without disappearance. This is how withdrawal works without disappearance. The gods don't need to be physically present in courtrooms to enforce their laws. They don't need to appear in person to judge cases. The entire legal system operates on the premise that divine authority established these principles, that divine justice underlies every verdict, and that divine punishment awaits those who violate the cosmic order even if that punishment isn't immediately visible. The threat of all-seeing oversight replaces the need for direct step-pinching. Political power becomes unquestionable. And because kings rule as divinely appointed executives of heavenly justice, their political power becomes morally unquestionable. Obeying the king isn't just smart self-interest or civic duty. It's religious obligation. The throne becomes sacred. The dynasty becomes holy. Resistance becomes sin. The global pattern. Meanwhile, this pattern of divine law isn't unique to Mesopotamia. Across ancient civilizations separated by geography and culture, the same formula appears. Law originates beyond humanity, requiring only human administrators to enforce cosmic principles that existed before any earthly ruler. Examples from other civilizations. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Ma'at represented cosmic order, truth, and justice not as abstract philosophy, but as a divine principle established by the gods at creation. Pharaohs ruled as keepers of Ma'at, enforcing laws that preserved cosmic balance, rather than inventing new social arrangements. The pharaoh wasn't the source of law. He was its earthly guardian. The Hebrew tradition presents the law of Moses as literally spoken by Yahweh on Mount Sinai, commandments carved in stone by divine hand, not human invention. The laws governing ancient Israel claim direct heavenly authorship. Obeying them means obeying God. Rejecting them means turning away from God. In China, the concept of the mandate of heaven legitimized imperial rule through divine selection. While the mandate could be withdrawn, allowing for change in dynasty when rulers became corrupt, the authority itself always flowed from heaven downward to earth. Human emperors managed cosmic order. They didn't create it. Even in Greece, where philosophical questioning eventually challenged traditional authority, early city-states credited their laws to divine sources. Lycurgus of Sparta supposedly received his constitution from the oracle at Delphi. Minos of Crete claimed to receive laws directly from Zeus. The legitimacy came from heaven, even in cultures that would later pioneer secular reasoning. A repeating pattern. The pattern repeats across civilizations that never contacted each other. Law doesn't start with humanity. Authority comes from above. And governance means enforcing principles established by forces beyond human society. Which suggests either an amazing coincidence in how power justifies itself or something more fundamental about how authority structures itself when claiming legitimacy beyond human consent. Why do other civilizations tell the same story? If divine authority persists even after divine presence fades, why do other civilizations tell the same story? Gods once close, then distant, yet power remains from above. The global pattern. The answer lies in recognizing that this isn't a Mesopotamian oddity. It's a global pattern across civilizations that developed independently, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. The same narrative structure appears. Gods once present. Gods now distant. Authority still claiming divine origin. Power flowing through go-betweens who control access to the withdrawn divine realm. The specifics differ. The names change. The theological frameworks vary. But the architecture remains remarkably consistent. Ancient Egypt. Consider ancient Egypt. The earliest Egyptian religious texts, the pyramid texts inscribed inside Old Kingdom royal tombs around 2300 BC, described gods walking on earth during a first age. Ra ruled as the first pharaoh before pulling back into the sky. Osiris governed the living before his death and transformation into lord of the underworld. The mythology preserves memory of a time when divine beings held earthly thrones directly. But by the historical dynasties, the gods no longer rule in physical form. Instead, pharaohs become living gods, not symbolically, but theologically. The pharaoh is the earthly form of Horus, the divine sun, maintaining Maat on behalf of the celestial order. Divine authority continues, but now channeled through a human body that bridges the gap between heaven and earth. The temple complexes function as the primary connection with divine power. Massive stone structures, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, serve as houses for the gods, where daily rituals maintain cosmic balance. Priests perform the same functions as their Mesopotamian counterparts, managing vast economic resources, controlling literacy and sacred knowledge, interpreting omens, and mediating between the invisible divine realm and earthly society. The gods have withdrawn into statues, into ritual, into specialized knowledge. But their authority over Egyptian civilization remains absolute. The Hebrew tradition. Meanwhile, in the Hebrew tradition documented in biblical texts, the same pattern emerges with striking clarity. The Genesis narrative describes Yahweh walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day, speaking directly with Adam in immediate physical closeness. God appears to Abraham, wrestles with Jacob, speaks face-to-face with Moses. The early portions of the Hebrew Bible depict divine presence as accessible, even conversational. But then, step by step, that closeness fades. After the Exodus and the establishment of the tabernacle, God speaks through the Ark of the Covenant from behind a veil only to the high priest, only on specific holy days. By the period of the kings, divine communication requires prophets, specialized go-betweens who receive visions, hear voices, and interpret signs that ordinary people cannot access. The prophets themselves lament this distance. Isaiah records God's words, "Truly, you are God who hides himself." The Psalms cry out asking why God seems absent. The entire structure of Israelite religion develops around managing a relationship with a deity who was once close, but has become remote. Yet, and this is crucial, divine authority over law, kingship, and social order never weakens. The Torah comes from Sinai. Kings rule under divine approval. Justice flows from commandments given by God. The covenant remains binding. Obedience is still required. Only now that obedience is mediated through priests, prophets, temple ritual, and textual interpretation. The system persists without direct divine presence. Greece. In Greece, the pattern appears in different theological language, but with the same underlying structure. Hesiod's works and days describes a golden age when gods and humans lived together, dining at the same tables, sharing the same spaces. The gods were present, visible, interactive. But later ages, silver, bronze, iron, describe increasing distance between the divine and human realms. By the historical period, the gods have withdrawn to Mount Olympus, stepping into human affairs only occasionally, indirectly through dreams, omens, or brief appearances. Yet their authority over fate, justice, and cosmic order remains unchanged. And how do humans access divine will? Through oracles. The oracle at Delphi becomes the most famous priestesses, breathing sacred vapors, entering trance states, delivering mysterious prophecies that require priestly interpretation. Kings consult the oracle before making decisions. City-states seek divine guidance through ritual procedures controlled by specialized temple personnel. The gods are distant, but their voices can still be accessed through carefully managed channels. China. Even in China, where the theological framework differs dramatically from Mediterranean traditions, the same architecture appears. The concept of the mandate of heaven positions the emperor as the go-between between celestial order and earthly governance. Heaven, Tian, represents cosmic moral authority that selects rulers based on virtue. The emperor is the son of heaven, ruling not by personal power but by divine appointment. When dynasties fail, it's interpreted as heaven withdrawing the mandate and granting it to new rulers. The system allows for political change, while maintaining the principle that legitimate authority always flows from above, never starts from below. And who interprets whether a ruler still has the mandate? Scholars, priests, and court officials who read celestial omens, maintain historical records, and control access to the classical texts that define proper governance. Heaven remains the source of authority even when heaven never appears. The pattern becomes unmistakable. The pattern becomes unmistakable when looked at together. Phase 1: Gods rule directly, walk among humans, make decisions visibly, interact personally with earthly affairs. Phase 2: Gods pull back into the sky, into hidden realms, into silence. But their authority over law, kingship, and cosmic order continues unchanged. Phase 3: Priests, prophets, oracles, and ritual specialists become necessary channels through which divine will can be known, and divine authority can be used on earth. Phase 4: Temples, palaces, and administrative systems form around the management of divine authority, creating permanent structures that last across generations. The gods may be absent, but the systems claiming divine authorization become self-running. The question conventional explanations struggle to answer. This raises a question that conventional explanations struggle to answer. If these patterns emerge independently across civilizations that had no contact with each other, why do they converge on the same solution? Either this represents a universal psychological mechanism how human societies naturally structure authority when moving from tribal to statelleval organization, or it preserves a memory of something that actually happened in multiple places following similar patterns. Mainstream explanation. Mainstream scholarship favors the first explanation. Divine kingship and priestly mediation are simply effective technologies of rule that emerge naturally when societies become complex enough to require centralized authority. But that explanation doesn't address why the narrative structure specifically involves presence followed by withdrawal, rather than gods who were always distant or authority that was always human. Why does every tradition remember a time when gods were closer? Bloodline the most specific mechanism. But then, returning to Mesopotamia with sharper focus, something even more specific appears in the mechanism of continuity bloodline. It's not enough that kings claim divine appointment. They claim divine descent. Royal inscriptions don't just say the gods chose them. They say the gods are their ancestors. Kingship isn't merely authorized from heaven. It's inherited through lineage that traces back to divine origin. Examples. The Sumerian king list includes rulers described as sons of gods. Gilgamesh's epic identifies him as 2/3 divine, on a third human, his mother the goddess Ninsun, his father a mortal king. This isn't symbolic language in the context of the culture that produced it. It's genealogical claim. Later Mesopotamian dynasties continue this tradition. Kings trace their legitimacy through family lines that supposedly connect back to divinely chosen ancestors. The right to rule passes through blood, making certain families inherently sacred. The global pattern. This pattern extends globally. Egyptian pharaohs are literally divine. Japanese emperors claim descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. European monarchs will later claim divine right through apostolic succession and sacred bloodlines. Across civilizations, royal families protect their lineage with obsessive care, not just for political advantage, but because the lineage itself carries the authorization to rule. Power doesn't just claim divine origin in the distant past. It claims continuous connection through biological inheritance. The withdrawal strategy is even more sophisticated, which suggests the withdrawal strategy is even more sophisticated than simple institutional control. If authority flows through bloodlines rather than through achievement or popular agreement, then the divine source never truly becomes irrelevant. It remains embedded in the bodies of the ruling class itself. The gods don't need to reappear if their authority is literally inherited, passed down through generations like genetic memory. The question transforms. This transforms the question from, how do societies maintain divine authority after gods withdraw, to something more unsettling. How do you challenge authority that claims to be biologically descended from cosmic sources? You can't vote out a bloodline. You can't reform an inheritance. You can't negotiate with genealogy. Why bloodline matters? If the gods don't rule openly anymore, why does power keep insisting it's inherited from them? And why does lineage become the most protected resource on Earth? The answer becomes clear when you examine how authority justifies itself across generations through blood. Divine appointment versus hereditary succession. Divine appointment solves the problem of initial legitimacy, explaining why one individual rather than another claims the throne. But hereditary succession solves an even more fundamental problem: how authority keeps going without requiring new divine step engine for every ruler. If kingship descends from heaven once and then passes through biological lineage, the system becomes self-sustaining. The gods need never reappear because their authorization flows through family lines like an inherited trait. Not symbolic language. This isn't symbolic language in the context of ancient Near Eastern political ideology. It's legal reality. Mesopotamian kings routinely claimed not just divine favor but divine ancestry. Royal inscriptions describe rulers as seed of specific gods' biological descendants, not merely chosen servants. Gilgamesh's status as 2/3 divine reflects a genealogical claim. His mother Ninsun was a goddess, making him literally part divine by blood. The Sumerian king list includes rulers identified as sons or descendants of deities. Later Babylonian and Assyrian kings trace their legitimacy through dynasties supposedly established by divine selection, with each generation inheriting the approval through sacred lineage. Royal hymns composed for kings like Shulgi, who ruled around 2100 BC, describe the ruler as chosen in the womb by the gods, formed specifically for kingship before birth. This isn't metaphor. It's claiming that divine will operates through biological generation, selecting certain individuals through their very conception. The implications. The implications are profound. If authority is inherited biologically, then certain families become inherently sacred. Their blood carries legitimacy. Their children are born with the right to rule embedded in their bodies. Challenging their authority isn't just political rebellion. It's an assault on cosmic order itself. Royal marriages. This is why royal marriages became matters of theological importance rather than mere political alliance. Sacred marriage ceremonies in Mesopotamia involved ritual union between the king and a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna, reenacting a cosmic marriage that supposedly occurred in mythic time, reinforcing the divine-human connection through symbolic reproduction. Kings didn't just rule cities. They embodied the relationship between heaven and earth. A structure in every city. Each major Mesopotamian city maintained this structure. The patron deity owned the city, lived in the central temple, and appointed the king as earthly representative. The king served as the god's manager, running divine property, enforcing divine law, leading festivals that maintained cosmic order. But the king was more than an employee. He was the living link between the visible and invisible realms, human enough to govern mortals, divinely approved enough to channel heavenly authority. The throne became the permanent symbol of divine presence after the gods withdrew from direct rulership. Psychological impact. Consider what this means psychologically for a civilization. The gods may no longer walk visibly in the streets, but they remain present through their appointed representative who sits on the throne, wears the sacred objects, performs the necessary rituals, and embodies the cosmic order in human form. The state becomes the afterimage of divine rule, a structure that continues to function as if the gods are still actively governing, using human institutions as their instruments. Protection of bloodlines. And because legitimacy flows through bloodlines, royal families protect their lineages with obsessive care. Genealogies become sacred texts. Family trees become theological documents. The purity of royal blood becomes a matter of cosmic significance, rather than merely social prestige. Beyond Mesopotamia. This pattern extends well beyond Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs weren't just divinely appointed. They were gods in physical form, quite literally. The pharaoh was Horus on earth, maintaining Ma'at on behalf of the entire cosmic order. When the pharaoh died, he became Osiris, and his heir became the new Horus. Divinity passed through biological succession like a title of nobility, except the title was living god. Hebrew kings, though not claiming to be divine themselves, ruled through anointing that set them apart as specially chosen by God. The Davidic covenant promised that David's lineage would hold the throne forever. Biological descent from the right family became theological necessity. Later, European monarchies developed the concept of divine right of kings, the idea that royal authority flows directly from God and cannot be legitimately challenged by earthly powers. Kings weren't just politically powerful. They were sacredly appointed. And their children inherited that sacred status through blood. Japanese emperors claimed direct descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, making the imperial family literally divine by ancestry. The emperor wasn't merely chosen by the gods. He was their biological descendant, carrying divine essence in his bloodline. The pattern repeats. Across civilizations, the pattern repeats. Authority claims origin beyond humanity and embeds the claim in hereditary succession, making certain families inherently illegitimate in ways that go beyond human choice or merit. The genius of this system. The genius of this system is its toughness. Gods who rule directly can be defeated, overthrown, or proven false. But authority that operates through bloodlines becomes nearly impossible to challenge without destroying the entire conceptual framework of legitimate power. If you accept that some families carry divine authorization in their blood, then political change requires not just military victory but theological revolution. You can't simply replace one ruler with another. You have to dismantle the entire structure of inherited sacred authority. Why bloodlines are protected. This is why royal bloodlines become the most protected resource in ancient civilizations. They're not just families. They're the vessels through which cosmic order remains connected to earthly governance, after the gods themselves have withdrawn from direct management. The throne preserves divine presence through biological continuity. Surveillance theology. But then, in the later periods of Mesopotamian civilization, particularly during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, something even more sophisticated appears in the historical record. The gods don't just withdraw and leave authority to hereditary rulers. They establish systems of ongoing surveillance. Extensive omen literature preserved from these periods reveals a civilization that believed the gods were constantly watching, constantly communicating through signs, constantly monitoring human affairs even while remaining physically invisible. The gods aren't absent, they're observing. The distinction matters. The distinction matters enormously. Absent gods might eventually be forgotten. Observing gods maintain perpetual psychological presence even without physical appearance. Late Mesopotamian astronomy. Late Mesopotamian astronomy develops into a precise science specifically because celestial movements were interpreted as divine communication. Lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, unusual atmospheric events all were recorded carefully and linked with earthly events to build predictive models of divine intention. The gods speak through the sky. They send messages through patterns in nature. They reveal their will through the arrangement of sacrificed animal organs. They're always there, always watching, always communicating. You just need the right training to understand their language. Living under constant divine oversight. This creates a civilization living under constant divine oversight without requiring divine appearances. Kings make decisions based on omens. Priests maintain elaborate procedures for divination before any major action. The entire society orients itself toward figuring out the will of gods who are simultaneously absent and and gone from sight, but not from influence. Surveillance theology defined. If lineage preserved divine authority, what role did omens, astrology, and divination play in maintaining the sense that the gods were still monitoring the world? The answer reveals something far more sophisticated than simple religious tradition, a system designed to maintain divine presence through observation rather than step engine. By the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, roughly 900 to 500 BC, Mesopotamian civilization had developed what can only be described as surveillance theology. The gods weren't absent. They were watching, and they communicated their observations through signs that required professional interpretation, not superstition. This wasn't superstition in the sense of random fear. It was systematic, documented, and treated as scientific knowledge. Massive collections of omen texts have been recovered from sites like Nineveh and Babylon, thousands of tablets, cataloging links between celestial events and earthly happenings. These weren't vague prophecies. They were detailed conditional statements following precise formulas. If an eclipse occurs in the month of Nisanu and the sky is dark, the king will die and his son will seize the throne. If Jupiter stands in the Scorpion constellation, the harvest will be abundant. If the moon is surrounded by a halo, there will be rebellion in the land. The tablets record centuries of astronomical observations paired with corresponding historical events, building databases meant to reveal the patterns through which divine will shows up in the visible world. The logic is elegant. If gods live in heaven and heaven is constantly visible, then heaven's movements are a continuous message. The gods aren't silent. You're just not reading carefully enough. The Bear diviners. Specialized priests called Bear diviners spend years training in the interpretation of these signs. They maintained astronomical diaries recording lunar phases, planetary positions, weather events, and unusual celestial occurrences. They consulted the accumulated omen catalogs to determine what specific arrangements meant for the king, for the city, for military campaigns, for the harvest. They were reading the sky like a text written in divine language. Psychological impact. Consider the psychological impact of living in such a civilization. Every eclipse becomes a potential warning. Every unusual cloud formation might signal divine displeasure. Every conjunction of planets carries meaning that must be figured out. The gods never appear in physical form, but their gaze is constant and inescapable, shown through the unchanging mathematics of celestial motion. You can't hide from the sky. It watches everyone all the time. More powerful than direct intervention. This creates a form of control more powerful than direct step engine. When gods appear physically and issue commands, people might resist, question, or test the limits of divine authority. But when gods communicate only through signs that require priestly interpretation, resistance becomes impossible because you never quite know what the gods are saying until the specialists tell you. And who employs those specialists? Who funds the observatories? Who orders the omen readings before major decisions? The palace and the temple, the same institutions claiming divine authorization. Royal correspondence. The Assyrian royal letters preserve exchanges between kings and their court astrologers, revealing how thoroughly this system integrated into political decision-making. Kings didn't just consult omens for major military campaigns. They delayed ordinary administrative actions, postponed public appearances, and changed travel plans based on astronomical observations. One letter from an astrologer to the Assyrian king Esarhaddon reads, "The king, my lord, should not go out on the 18th day. It is not favorable. The moon will be eclipsed. The king should remain inside his palace." Another reports, "Concerning the eclipse about which the king wrote to me, it is good for the king. The eclipse has passed to the king's enemies." The diviners weren't simply reporting celestial data. They were translating divine communication into actionable political intelligence. And because interpretation is subjective, they could frame even threatening omens as confirmations of royal policy. The eclipse happens not because the gods oppose the king, but because they're warning his enemies. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Surveillance extended beyond astronomy. Meanwhile, this surveillance extended beyond astronomy into every aspect of daily life. Extispicy liver divination remained the primary method for figuring out divine will regarding specific questions. Before making important decisions, kings would order sacrifices and have trained specialists examine the organs for irregularities that showed divine approval or warning. The livers themselves were mapped like anatomical charts with symbolic significance. Dozens of clay models of livers have been discovered, covered in cuneiform inscriptions marking specific features and their meanings. These weren't crude superstitions. They were technical manuals for a specialized profession that operated according to detailed procedural standards. Other forms of divination, oil divination, smoke divination, dream interpretation all followed similar patterns. The divine realm constantly sends signals. Reality itself becomes a text written by the gods, and priests are the only ones trained to read it. Living under perpetual observation. This creates a civilization living under perpetual observation. Every decision, every action, every plan must be checked against the possibility that the gods have already communicated their judgment through some sign that hasn't yet been properly interpreted. You don't just act and hope for divine approval. You search for divine signals before acting, and then act in accordance with what the signs reveal. What this system doesn't require. But notice what this system doesn't require. The gods themselves appearing, speaking directly, stepping in physically, or showing their existence in ways that could be verified by ordinary observation. The entire mechanism operates on the assumption that gods exist, gods watch, gods communicate, but always through mediated channels that require specialized knowledge to access. Questioning the system. And what happens if someone questions whether the omens are real? Whether the signs actually carry divine meaning? Whether the gods are truly sending messages through eclipses and animal organs? They're questioning not just religious tradition, but the entire framework of political legitimacy, legal authority, and social order, because all of it rests on the premise that power flows from divine sources that communicate through these exact channels. To doubt the omens is to doubt kingship. To reject divination is to reject the cosmic authorization of law. The system protects itself by making skepticism existentially dangerous. Why the gods don't need to reappear. This is why the gods don't need to reappear. They've established a governance structure that functions perfectly in their absence. Indeed, perhaps functions better in their absence because physical presence invites testing, questioning, and potential disobedience, while invisible oversight maintains constant uncertainty about divine will that can only be resolved through institutional go-betweens. The architecture becomes complete. The late Mesopotamian world doesn't abandon the Anunnaki. It perfects the method of ruling through them while they remain unseen. Kings still claim divine appointment. Priests still control access to divine knowledge. Laws still carry heavenly authority. And now, additionally, every political decision can be justified as response to divine communication, delivered through celestial signs that only specialists can properly interpret. The architecture becomes complete. Hereditary bloodlines preserve divine legitimacy. Priestly institutions mediate divine will. Ritual systems maintain divine favor. Omen interpretation provides ongoing divine surveillance without requiring the gods to physically appear. The haunting question. Which brings us to the question that haunts this entire investigation. If you wanted to design a system of governance that could continue operating indefinitely without requiring the physical presence of the authorities who supposedly established it, you would create exactly this. Hereditary legitimacy through sacred bloodlines. Institutional control of communication channels. Legal frameworks claiming non-human origin. Surveillance mechanisms that maintain the psychological sense of being constantly observed by powers that never need to reveal themselves. The Mesopotamian system, by the first millennium BC, had become precisely that. The final question. If the Anunnaki truly disappeared, why did their governance architecture remain so intact? Kingship, priesthood, divine law, and surveillance by omen, almost like a system designed to run without them. There is no departure narrative. After examining thousands of years of Mesopotamian texts from the earliest Sumerian myths through the latest Babylonian astronomical diaries, one fact becomes inescapable. There is no departure narrative. No epic describes the gods holding a final assembly and announcing their withdrawal from Earth. No ritual text remembers a farewell ceremony. No king records the moment divine beings stopped appearing in the temples. No priest documents the day the gods stopped responding to offerings. The texts simply stop describing gods as direct actors, and start describing them as authorizing sources without ever acknowledging that anything changed. This silence is itself the most revealing evidence. 3 distinct phases. What we can trace is a gradual shift in mode across 3 distinct phases. Phase 1, mythic time. Preserved in epics like Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, and the Eridu Genesis gods, appear as characters in narratives. They debate in assemblies. They assign territories. They create humanity. They step into disputes. They issue decrees. They walk on earth as active participants in the world's governance. Phase 2, historical time. Documented in royal inscriptions, temple archives, and legal codes spanning roughly 3000 BC to 500 BC, those same gods become the sources of authority, rather than its executives. Kings rule because the gods appointed them. Laws carry force because the gods wrote them. Temples function because the gods own them. But the gods themselves no longer appear as actors in current events. They're called upon, referenced, and claimed as authority, but never described as physically present in the way earlier myths showed them. Phase 3, late astronomical time. Particularly during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the gods transform again into watchers who communicate only through signs. They're no longer absent, but they're no longer present either. They exist in a third state: constant observation without direct step engine, perpetual communication without physical appearance. The transition is seamless. The transition between these modes isn't marked by crisis or catastrophe in the surviving record. It's seamless, organic, almost invisible except in looking back when you compare texts from different periods, and notice that the relationship between gods and humans has fundamentally restructured itself without anyone commenting on the change. The withdrawal is so quiet, it might not even be called a withdrawal at all. It's more like a reconfiguration. Nothing actually changes. And yet this is the key point. Nothing about how civilization operates actually changes. After the gods stop appearing as direct actors, kings still rule by divine approval, claiming authorization from beings who no longer visibly confirm their appointments. Priests still interpret divine will, going between the invisible divine realm and earthly society, through rituals performed for gods who never physically respond. Laws still carry heavenly authority, enforcing cosmic order on behalf of sources that can't be questioned because they can't be accessed, except through institutional channels. Temples still function as divine residences and economic centers, managing vast resources on behalf of landlords who never collect rent in person. Divination systems still operate as if every eclipse, every cloud formation, every irregularity in a sacrificed liver is a message from gods who are constantly watching, but never speaking directly. The machinery continues without its operators. More than continues, it thrives. More than continues, it thrives. The systems claiming divine origin become more elaborate, more institutionalized, more sophisticated in the very period when divine presence becomes most invisible. Profoundly unsettling. This is what makes the Mesopotamian record so profoundly unsettling. Power operates without presence. Authority functions without appearance. And obedience continues without enforcement. All maintained through a governance architecture that behaves exactly as if it were designed to run indefinitely, in the absence of those who supposedly established it. How do we interpret this pattern? Which brings us to the final question. How do we interpret this pattern? History offers three explanations, each internally consistent, each supported by different aspects of the evidence. Explanation 1: Legitimacy technology. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats divine rule as a legitimacy technology and narrative framework that early states used to justify centralized authority during the transition from tribal societies to complex civilizations. In this view, gods were never literally present. They were always projections of human political needs, personifications of natural forces, or symbolic representations of cosmic order. The withdrawal isn't a historical event. It's a narrative evolution that occurs as societies mature. Early states needed creation myths showing gods establishing civilization to answer the question of where authority came from. Later states needed those same gods to remain as authorizing sources, while human institutions did the actual governing. The progression from divine actors to divine authorizers to divine watchers reflects humanity's increasing sophistication in structuring power without requiring supernatural explanations. Evidence supporting this view. No archaeological proof of divine beings ever existing. Comprehensive anthropological parallels showing how all complex societies develop similar legitimacy narratives. Explanation 2: Distorted memories. An alternative interpretation suggests that myths preserve distorted memories of actual historical realities, not gods in a literal supernatural sense, but earlier forms of human civilization, whose achievements seemed so advanced to later cultures that they were remembered as divine. Perhaps the Anunnaki represent memories of a predecessor civilization whose knowledge, organization, or technology far exceeded what followed after some catastrophic break. The withdrawal would then reflect real historical collapse, the end of an advanced society, whose systems were partially preserved by survivors who no longer understood their original source. The flood narratives preserved across cultures might record actual climate catastrophe. The impossibly long reigns in the Sumerian king list might represent compressed time periods or alternative timekeeping systems, misunderstood by later copyists. The persistent claim that civilization's fundamental institutions descended from heaven might preserve memory that they came from somewhere else, an earlier culture, a different region, a lost knowledge base. Evidence supporting this view. Geological records of catastrophic climate events around 11,600 years ago. The archaeological puzzle of seemingly sudden farming and architectural sophistication in certain regions. The consistency of flood mythology across disconnected cultures. Explanation 3: Self-perpetuating architecture. The third interpretation, the one suggested by the question, what if the Anunnaki never truly disappeared, suggests something more unsettling. Whether the gods were literal beings, symbolic constructs, or memories of earlier civilizations, the system they established behaves exactly as if it were designed to keep going without requiring their physical presence. This isn't claiming the Anunnaki remain as bodies or physical entities. It's observing that they remain as architecture, as the foundational structure of how authority, law, hierarchy, and legitimacy function. If you wanted to create a governance system that could continue controlling civilization indefinitely without your direct involvement, you would design precisely what we see in Mesopotamia. Authority claiming non-human origin, making it unquestionable by human reasoning. Hereditary transmission through bloodlines, making it biologically embedded rather than politically negotiable. Institutional go-betweens controlling all communication channels with the claimed divine source. Surveillance mechanisms maintaining psychological presence without physical appearance. Legal frameworks presented as cosmic principles rather than human inventions. The system becomes self-running because every element references a source beyond itself, creating circular validation that can be challenged without dismantling the entire structure. Evidence supporting this view. The remarkable persistence of divine kingship, priestly mediation, and sacred law across civilizations spanning thousands of years. The fact that these systems survived even after the gods they reference became culturally forgotten. The observation that modern governance still operates through many of these same structural principles, authority claiming sources beyond popular will, institutions mediating between citizens and power, law presented as foundational rather than constructed. History doesn't offer a verdict. History doesn't offer a verdict between these three explanations. Each civilization must choose which interpretation makes sense of the evidence or perhaps accept that all three contain partial truth. That myths serve political functions while also preserving memories, while also creating self-running systems that outlast their origins. The pattern is undeniable. What remains undeniable is the pattern itself. Gods who once ruled openly, then ruled through go-betweens, then ruled through absence, and somehow the world continued obeying. The greatest achievements. Maybe the Anunnaki didn't remain as beings. Maybe they remained as blueprint, the fundamental architecture of how power structures itself when claiming legitimacy beyond human consent. And if that's true, then their greatest achievement wasn't descending from heaven to establish civilization. It was designing civilization to function as if they never left. The final haunting question. If a civilization can be controlled by an authority it never sees, how would we even recognize the moment we stop being ruled by heaven?